The firm I represent, we both represent a firm called ehsInc. Summarizing us in a nutshell, we specialize in health and safety consulting and training. Consulting, written program development, job hazard analyses, risk assessments, temporary safety specialist placement, the list goes on and on. Under the training side of things, pretty much the crux of what we do is on-site safety education, customizing it to what you guys do and your environment. I'm not going to go into great detail, but if you folks need assistance on that, any outsourced assistance on safety education and consulting, give us a shot. And as your third bullet point will tell you, if you have any requirements to fulfill these business enterprise certifications, we have all of them except for veteran.
Good morning, I'm Georgette, and as it says on the slide, I am a safety instructor. I've been in the business for over 30 years, actually over 35 years. Wow. I have some credentials. I'm always expanding my knowledge. I'm always out there in the field looking for more stuff to learn and to relearn, and these are some of the safety topics that I work in on a regular basis. So let's get started. Today's agenda, we're going to talk about the rules and regs that we have to deal with on no matter where you are, and we'll talk about that in a minute. What the training requirements are, your general safety precautions, some operating rules, the hazards, classifications and types of the powered industrial trucks or forklifts that you're working with, pre-shift inspections, and what your refueling and recharging looks like. So first of all, let's start with the applicable rules and regulations. So across the country, we always start with the federal law, which is the OSHA 29 CFR 1910-178 for powered industrial trucks. If you are a state plan state, i.e. California, Oregon, or some other states, then you need to check on their rules and regulations. Then if you're outside the country and your country happens to have some rules and regulations, you need to refer to those also. ANSI has a standard of B56. ASMA has a standard of B56-1 from 1993. It's a safety standard for low lift and high lift trucks. The CDC, which we know as mostly Center of Disease Control, but it actually connects with NIOSH, which is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. And they have a publication from 2001 that also refers to preventing injuries in powered industrial trucks. And again, if you're in a state that has a state plan state, then you need to look at that also as part of your written program. So we are here in California. I am trying to think on a broader range and on a national level. So knowing what your state or what the federal rules require for you to have for programs is what you need to reference to. So the training requirements, basically, no one under the age of 18 should be on a piece of mobile equipment. And if you're over 18, then you need to make sure that your operators are competent to operate that piece of equipment. And that needs to be demonstrated by a completion of training and evaluation. The employer is required to make sure that you do not put an employee on a piece of a mobile equipment of any kind without having that successful completion of training and evaluation by a competent person. So the training requirements, we'll go through OSHA, requires that every 3 years you need a minimum of some kind of evaluation. So let's just stay with that here for a minute. Every person needs to have formal training. We just recognize that. After that, every 3 years, I would say at least once a year, there should be some kind of evaluation. It's mandatory to have some kind of retraining. However, if you see an operator that operates a forklift in an unsafe manner, if they're involved in a near miss or an accident, if they fail their performance evaluation, or if they're assigned to a different classification, when you do formal training for someone on a piece of mobile equipment, they are only qualified to use that piece of equipment. So if it's a sit-down counterbalance, they're only at 3,500 pounds, and they're only qualified to drive that piece of equipment. If they're on a walk behind, then they're only qualified to operate that type of equipment. If for some reason you put them on a different type of equipment, then you have to go back to square one, train them, get them qualified to be on that piece of equipment. Now, your evaluation can be as simple as going out and saying, hey, Fred, I need to evaluate you while you do your job. Is that okay? This needs to happen every 3 years. And you can evaluate them from there. My recommendation, my personal recommendation, is that they sit down in a classroom, have a little bit of overview of the type of things that are going on in your workplace. Maybe talk about accidents and near misses that are happening in your workplace. Talk about some of the things that you want to make sure they do better on as a group, and then take them outside and do a hands-on evaluation. So it can be a matter of different things. Recommendation, like I said, get them in a room, sit them down, and talk to them about what's going on in the workplace. Some general safety precautions. So there's 3 areas that we can talk about here. Train all that you can. My personal feeling is you can never train enough. The more a person is involved in your training and trained, the better off they're going to be able to make the right decisions when they're out in the field. Posting your operating rules. In the state of California, it's actually required to state the operating rules, to post the operating rules. So that, again, you would want to check what your state says. Federal law has some information that you can post. Have everyone read the operator's manual. When you first do the formal training, the operator's manual should be in the classroom, and it should be walked through. Then also read and train the company forklift safety written program. So each company, if you have a forklift or mobile equipment in the workplace, you need to have a formal written program, and that is geared to what your company does and how you're going to train your people, what you're going to train your people on, the hazards in the workplace that are unique to you. And all of that stuff should be in that written program. Then you get into your formal training, and like I said, reminder training. I like to at least once a year get out there and bring somebody in and just bring a group of people in, maybe for half an hour, or just tailgate training, meetings, or whatever that looks like. And then, of course, every 3 years, your refresher training as required.
Georgette, we got a question from Lisa. I'm going to read it to you verbatim. The forklift written program, is that part of the injury and illness prevention program, or is it a standalone program?
Okay, good question, Lisa. So here at, it must be California because you're talking about the injury illness prevention program. So what we like to do here at EHS is the IIPP, we have it as a separate document. And then separate out the formal written program for your powered industrial trucks separately. The reason for that, when you bring someone in to work at your workplace, they may be an office worker. So do they need to go through the PIT program? No. They need to know the basic IIPP program that you have. Only the people that are going to be driving a forklift will need to go to the powered industrial truck program. So that's the kind of the way we work it through here at EHS, is to keep it as simple as possible and keep your programs separated from your IIPP.
She says perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So okay, number 2, concentrate on working safely. So creating that safety environment culture in your workplace is you don't want your workers risking shortcuts. You want the kind of environment that they're going to stop and think, how can I do this safely, not just push through a deadline, because accidents can leave people permanently injured. So what's the end goal with your employees? The end goal is to get them home safely to their families at the end of the day. So one of the things that we like to do here is create that safety environment culture at the workplace, so that the employee is always saying to themselves, how can I do this and be safe? And take that home 24 hours. You're out there loading up your truck. How can I be safe and not injure my back while I'm loading up my truck to go camping for the weekend? But if you start that safety culture at work, it usually filters out into the home life too. So looking at common alert symbols, this gets into your equipment, on your equipment, in and around the workplace. This is a very generic, basic. Red means you can be seriously injured or killed. Yellow is a cautionary, could be cause serious hurt or be killed at that. And then white is usually careful, follow directions. So that gets back into getting that mindset of the employee to work safely, think safely before they move. And then number 3, you want to be aware of your employees' health. So making sure that they are at the top of their game. If an employee comes in sick and they're taking medication, are they okay to drive? If you see that a person looks like they're impaired, you might want to have a conversation with them and ask them if maybe today they're not driving, you're on medication, let's put you doing something else so that everybody stays safe on the job. So some operating rules. Now, these are things that are pretty generic. Like I said, you need to go back to the federal law. If you're in a fed state, if you're in a state, then you need to look at the regulations that for that state. The operating rules for the state of California look like this. And this is what we were talking about, posting operating rules for industrial truck. There might be something in your state, if you're from Oregon or Washington, similar to this, but you want to check your rules and regs to make sure that you're staying in compliance with that. So seat belts. So are they required? Well, I had to look this one up to make sure that I was telling you the correct information in that. If it's provided by the truck manufacturer, an operator restraint system such as a seat belt shall be used, is what the terminology says. So a national consensus standard, ASME, requires that powered industrial trucks manufactured after 1992 must have a restraint device. So most of the trucks out there are after 1992, but I can tell you when I first started this back 30, 40 years ago, a lot of trucks were not. And when they came out with the idea that we needed a seatbelt restraint, there was a lot of pushback on it. And there still is today a lot of pushback. I'll go into a client and find out that the seatbelt's been latched together and shoved underneath the seat so that they don't have to use it. Again, it is required if it's on the forklift, and especially if the forklift is manufactured after 1993. Why do we need seat belts? There's several reasons for needing a seat belt. It keeps a person in the lift, no matter if something is coming down on top of them or if the lift has if it starts to roll over, it keeps the person inside the lift. The cage is built so that it protects a person. And so if there's any danger, if that driver just grabs onto that steering wheel and hangs on tight and stays tight, then the damage would be minimal compared to if they did not have a seatbelt on and there was something that was going on and they got thrown from the forklift. You can lose arms, legs, heads. There's a lot of damage. So this actually can be a long conversation wearing seatbelts. I've had long conversations with people about having a seatbelt. But the law says you have to, if you have it, you have to use it. And go back to the manufacturer. All right, so the other thing, as you're training your employees, of course, some of the most important things that they need to know about the equipment is the controls. And there's forklifts that have 2 levers, 3 levers, and sometimes 4, depending on the type of forklift and what it's built to do and what your job requirements are. Understanding what your overhead clearance and your side clearance in a forklift is very important for your employee to know. That comes with the rear end swing of the forklift, or if you're going into very tight spaces. What are some of the adjustments of a forklift? The forks on the front of the forklift, or height adjustments, or anything like that. What's the balance point? The fulcrum point of your forklift is very important for employees to understand when you're training them. What their load rating is very, very important. The forklift is built on a fulcrum, like a teeter-totter. So if you are overloading, then you are putting your driver, or the driver's putting themselves in harm's way, maybe other people in the area, but it's also hurting the mobile equipment itself. You can start doing damage to it. And back to the turning radians for the overhead clearance or side clearance of a forklift, that turning radius is also very important for a driver to know. So when I've been training people on forklifts, those are some of the main points that I look for. Do they understand what the controls do? Do they understand what the turning radius of the forklift is? Do they understand how to find out where the load rating is? Do you know where that is? It's on the capacity plate that's somewhere on the forklift. Should be legible. If you can't read it, then you need to go back to the manufacturer and get a new one to read. So these are some of the most important points. And here's one very important point: the stability triangle of a forklift. Your center of gravity is usually right underneath the seat where the where the driver is sitting. And then depending on how you lift your load, how heavy your load is, how high you lift your load, that center of gravity will start to change and it moves towards the front of the forklift. So if you have maximum load on your forklift, your center of gravity is going to be right in between the 2 wheels of your forklift. Understanding this as a driver is very important, especially when you're working in warehouse situations and you're all day long moving loads and putting them in racks, sometimes 4, 6 levels high. Is very important to understand what your loads are and what your center of gravity can do. So your forklift steering is very different than from a car. Cars steer from the front and forklifts steer from the rear. So knowing that is very important too. I've seen people get on forklifts and try to drive them like a car. It just doesn't work. So a forklift, you can pretty much spin on a dime if you know what you're doing. So again, that's another and very important part of your training, and that's another thing that I look for, because it also gives us an idea of they understand that rear end swing and what kind of room that gives them with that type of forklift that they're driving. Brakes and warning devices. Obviously, we want our brakes to work, right? But the other thing that I see in a lot of forklift, our warning devices aren't working. And that should be a light on the back of the forklift that flashes. and a beeper on the back of the forklift when you're backing up. And if you're working in dark areas, then you need headlights, kind of like a headlight that would be on the overhead guard. And again, your warning device that when you're in backup, when you put it in a backup, that it's beep, beep, beep. Now it can be annoying, and sometimes I'll find them that have been disconnected, and that is very wrong. It needs to be working so that people know that you're in the area.
Georgette, we have a question coming in.
Sure. From
Alex. We fabricated a cage. Is that okay for us to put employees into it?
A cage that goes on the forks to lift a person up, an operating cage. Okay, so yes and no. Yes, you need to have a cage for if you're going to be lifting operators. No about fabrication. It needs to be, you need to go back to the manufacturer and talk to them about the type of cage that you can put on the front of the forklift. Make sure that it fits the forks, that it doesn't take away from the stability of the cage or the forks or the pins of the forks that hold on to the carriage so that they don't move, that you have a restraining chain of some sort that goes onto the backrest of the forklift. There's many things that have to happen with that cage. So the first thing you need to do is go back to the manufacturer. I hope that answers it. If not, just come back at Eric and he'll let me know.
Thank you.
All right, some more general rules. Usually when you're indoors, no more than 3 to 5 miles an hour. And some of the ways that we can stop that from happening, because I've gone in and seen that in warehouses when people drive way too fast, is to govern it down, and the manufacturer can do that to you, so that when the forklift is working inside, like most do, you can keep it between 3 and 5 miles an hour. Keeping distances when you're traveling in the same direction, 3 truck lengths or 3-second rule is what we normally use. And if you're in a big warehouse with a lot of forklifts going around, then that needs to be a huge rule that needs to be adhered to. Otherwise, you're going to be banging into each other. And talking about banging into each other, one of the ways that you know that your forklift is being banged into or banging into other things, of course, is you see damage to your product or to the building or to posts in the building. But the back end of the forklift has a lot of damage on it, a lot of different paint marks on it, or paint washed, been scraped off of it. One of the places that I used to work, we had a lot of damage when I first went into the job, and we couldn't figure out who was doing what, because we had 3 shifts, 7 days a week. So what we did is we painted each forklift a different color, and then people were assigned to forklifts, and that stopped the damage right away. So there's a lot of different ways that you can look at trying to stop that damage. One of them is to create a culture that people care about the equipment and care about the product that they're working around. But there's other ways that you can do that too. We always want to make sure that our forks are off the ground. I see this a lot, forks dragged a lot, and what happens is the tail end of the fork, the fork is tapered, so at the back end of the fork, it could be like 2, 3, 4 inches thick, and then it tapers down to the toe of the fork. If you're dragging your forks a lot, you're going to see that wear down, and what'll happen is that you're going to lose the integrity of the fork, and eventually you'll see cracks in the fork if you're dragging forks all the time. So that traveling 2 to 4 inches off the ground is one of the things that you should train with them. Obeying all traffic regulations. If you got forklifts out in the streets, usually not, but if you're in parking lots or if you're working in outdoors a lot, then traffic regulations come into effect, and no more than 15 miles per hour outside. All right, ramps is another one that I see forklifts all the time. Wrong way, going the wrong way. So making sure that the load is always against the backrest. And the one way to do that is when you train, when a person picks up a load, is that once they lift and they're 2 to 4 inches off the ground, that they tilt back just a little bit. And then when you're driving up a grade in excess of 10%, then that load should be upgrade. The reason for that is that your fulcrum point. So you have your weight in the back, you have your counterweight in the back, and then you have the weight of the load in the front. So it's safe if that is the safest way to drive. Now, if you're going downhill, drive forward down ramps and drive backwards up the ramp if you're unloaded. Do you ever see that? We never see that. We never see people when they're unloaded drive backwards up a ramp. That is the safest way to do that. Why is that? Because the counterbalance, you want the weight uphill. If the weight is downhill and you don't have any weight on the front, you could lose that traction on your front tires where your fulcrum point is. You can lose your traction on the drive wheels. So if the grade is enough to pull that weight off of those drive wheels, you could lose control of your forklift. We never see that. Never see that. All right, entering trucks. The forklift operator is responsible for the security of the trailer, period. You should never allow a truck driver to dictate how a forklift driver is going to go in and out of their truck. I've seen so many accidents in trucks. The operator of the lift truck needs to be in control of that truck, and whatever that means. So chalking the wheels, checking the dock boards, checking the interior trailers. If you have a trailer that's come in that's loaded and you're unloading it and you see cardboard or plywood on the floor of the truck, what is that telling you? Could be a problem. And if your forklift weighs, let's just say a forklift weighs 4,000 pounds and you're lifting 4,000 pounds, that's 8,000 pounds. 4 tons that is going in and out of a truck that may have a marginal floor. You're looking for a disaster. And I've seen forklifts go through trucks, the floor of trucks. So you always want to make sure that the trailer is safe going in and out. One of the ways we used to stop our drivers from doing anything in their truck is that the keys had to be on a clip on a board, on a hook on the board in the office of the warehouse. So when a driver came in, he checked in, had his paperwork, his keys went up on the board. He could go out and do whatever he wanted in his truck, but the keys had to be in control in the warehouse. But there's other different ways that you can look at that too. So again, going back, the forklift operator is responsible for the security of that truck and their safety.
Quick question, Georgette. We might have already covered this, but a question came in. We have manually operated pallet jacks. Do we need to certify our employees to operate them?
Manually operated?
I'm assuming they mean non-powered.
Yes, not mobile, no. Is there some information that they need to have when they're operating a manually pallet jack? Yeah, yes.
Okay.
I mean, I wouldn't just say, hey, go use that.
Got it.
I would talk to a person about the proper way to use one. Some people, I didn't know. When I first started working in a warehouse, I was given a pallet jack to use. I had no clue. So yes, give them some instruction on it. All right, when we're lifting material, you want to place your forks as wide as possible for the load. And that's important. I've been in warehouses and seen forks that are like a foot apart. Okay, what does that tell me? Either they're not paying attention to their load, or their loads are only maybe 2 feet apart or 3 feet apart, and that's the proper way to use the forks. Make sure that they're locked in place, that there's a pin, and sometimes the pins are missing, but they shouldn't be. Again, you go back to the manufacturer to replace them, but the pins hold those forks in place. If not, the forks will start to drift. Never add a counterweight to a forklift. If you're lifting something that's too heavy for that piece of equipment, get a bigger piece of equipment, or somehow change the load weight so that you can use that piece of equipment. And don't lift the equipment that you're unfamiliar with. Lift material or equipment that you're unfamiliar with. Make sure that you size up the load. Like you can kind of see in the bottom of this picture, that little pallet of boxes there. So make sure that your material handling equipment can pick that up safely with whatever the load is. And if you don't know how much the load is, then try to figure it out. How much does one box weigh? Okay, we have 20 boxes times whatever the box weighs, or the lading, the bill of lading will tell you sometimes what things weigh. So some more operating rules. Only move a load when it is safe to do so. Check your surroundings. Make sure there's not people around you that are also doing something that could be in your way. Lift and tilt back to travel, to deposit onto a shelf, tilt level, then set. Just like I explained earlier, when you go to pick up a load, if everything is straight, your mast is straight up and down, that means your forks will be level. You go in and you pick up your load, then you tilt back just a little bit. I'm sorry. When you pick up your load, then you tilt back a little bit. Then look behind you, make sure it's safe to travel to do so, and pull out and lower your load, and then move to where you're going. When you get ready to deposit it, it's the same thing. You go in, you make sure that you're square with wherever you have to be, you tilt level, and then you set your load down. If you don't tilt level or pick up level, if you tilt before you pick up, then you're putting the weight of your forklift and the load onto the back part of the pallet. And that's how pallets start to split. And then when you start to set them down, if you set them down with the pallet just on the back rung, then it can split that pallet before you set level. So it's pick up, tilt back, tilt level, and set down. Adding an attachment or device that is not standard piece of the equipment can cause damage to your mobile equipment. If you need to add, say you're picking up rugs and you need to add one of those long poles, or you have a barrel clamp that you need to put on to pick up barrels, you need to go back to the manufacturer, because it changes, that equipment changes the amount of weight that you can pick up, and it changes the center of gravity for the forklift. So you always need to go back to the manufacturer if you need to add an attachment to a forklift.
This is an amazing comment. A little question too, but a question from John. Why don't forklifts have backup rear view cameras? Think about that. It's genius, right?
Yeah.
Maybe the new ones do. I don't know.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, forklifts have been around for a long time.
It makes complete sense, huh?
Well, you know what? I have mixed feelings about
okay.
that. Okay. So I have a backup camera in my new car. I don't use it because I need to look all the way around me. You know, I'm an older person, and it would make it very easy for me to look at my backup camera, but then I'm not looking to the side and the sides of me to make sure that I'm safe all the way around before I back up. Yeah. So I have mixed feelings about that. The new forklifts, I don't know.
He adds on, they can be helpful because they'll give you eyes for hidden objects. So I think they're implying that we'll use them in conjunction with our physical looking back and the technology.
Yeah, I mean, and that again, that's like I said, I'm an older person, so I have kind of that old school thing. Yeah. But as we get into the younger workforce, when they're used to that technology, but we need to make sure that we also teach them to always look all the way around. Yeah, to use their eyes. That's true. So there is a place for technology. I'm not going to deny that. Yeah.
Thanks, Georgette.
So the rated capacity of a forklift is found in your data plate. It should be displayed so that the operator can see it and they know exactly the capacity of their forklift. Now, again, if we get back to that training, see if we look at this capacity plate. When I train, that's the first thing one of the first things I do when we go out and look at a forklift is to see how much we can lift. So the capacity of the attachment on this forklift will lift 4,500 pounds at a 24-inch load center, and it'll lift it 188 inches into the air. Now, the other thing that we need to know about our forklift too is how much it weighs. So I'm looking at this, and it says on the left-hand side, load center 24 inches, 5,000 pounds, matching capacity. So this one is not really telling us how much the forklift weighs, unless it's 5,000 pounds. So I'd have to look at it a little bit closer. But there's also a little diagram on the capacity plate. So again, when you train somebody on a piece of equipment, train the capacity plate. When we park a forklift, it needs to be parked in a level area. I've seen many forklifts take off on their own, because once they're parked, if the parking brake isn't pulled, and the forklifts are not on the the forks are not on the ground with their tips down, then a forklift can move. So you want to make sure that you park a forklift that it's not going to be in the way, you don't block exits, that the engine is turned off. I always train that when a person gets off a forklift, they need to turn the forklift off. There is some, in the regulations, it does talk about leaving a forklift on, and there's some other things that go along with that. When I train, just like the post office drivers, when they have to get out of their truck, they have to turn it off. I always train when you get off a lift, you turn the engine off. And you, some cases, and this is going to be a company policy, what do you do with the keys? Do the keys stay in the truck? Do they go on a board? Do you have to check them out? So that would be your company policy on how you want to control how the trucks are being used. So operating hazards, these are going to be different for every location that you're in. So again, part of your training needs to talk about what your operation and the hazards that you have in your operation. So each forklift type presents a different type of operating hazard. Workplace type and conditions are also factors in hazard commonly associated with powered industrial trucks. So all of that has to be taken into consideration in your training. So your classification and the type of trucks. I almost took this out and I decided to leave it in so that you can take a look. So a class 1 forklift is an electric motor counterbalance rider. That's in the class 1. So then they have different codes. The reason I put this back in there is because this goes back to your manufacturer and to the manufacturer's manual that you need to train when you do your first formal training. A class 2 is what they call an order picker or reach type outrigger, low lift pallet and platform rider, side loader, turret truck, swing mask, and convertible turret or stock picker. So if any of your equipment looks like this, then it's considered a class 2. If you train somebody on this equipment, I'm going to go back to this one. They're not qualified to drive this one. They're only qualified to drive this one, and they will not be qualified to drive any of the other classes that we look at. So a class 3 is a low lift platform. I'm sorry, this picture should be back with your lift code. I'm sorry. Let me take a minute here. So your other class 3 forklifts, a lift code 2 is a low lift walker pallet. This might be what the gentleman was referring to before. So it'd be a low lift walker pallet. Like I said, you don't have to do a lot of formal training with this. You want to talk about the hazards in your workplace and go back to the pallet manual, and I'll give you what you need to train a person on for this. Okay. Yeah. All right, so then a class 4, and this is what mostly we do. Class 4s are what we call a sit-down counterbalance. This is a Class 5. The difference between a Class 4 and a Class 5 is pneumatic tires. Now go figure. I don't understand that, but that's the way they classify them. Okay,
so weird.
The only difference between that is pneumatic tires, air tires. A Class 6 is electric motor and like an ice tractor, sit-down rider, this type of thing. We see these in airports a lot.
That one always messes me up because there's no forks on it.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Yeah. So why is it under that? I get it.
Yeah, it's a piece of mobile equipment.
Got it.
Okay, yeah. So then a Class 7 is a rough terrain. And we see these a lot on construction sites and stuff, or if they're putting up material, especially up on a roof. All right, talking about hazardous areas. There was a lot of slides about hazardous materials, and I could spend a lot of time on this. Basically, this is what you need to know. They're potentially hazardous locations where they have metal dust, organic dust, flammable vapors and gases that may be in the atmosphere. I used to work at a place where we had flammable vapors. We worked with 81% alcohol. So we had to make sure that all the equipment, mobile or even a hand tool, could be in that area. It was a high hazard area. So basically what you need to know from this presentation is, if you may have a high hazardous area, make sure the equipment that you buy, especially the mobile equipment, and this is where your manufacturer comes in play, you pick the right type of equipment to be in that atmosphere. It's very, very important. So then these are some of the types, a DS and a DY. I'm not going to get into all this terminology and everything. I just wanted to show you that they are all different types that get into those high hazards. Pre-shift inspections. I go to a lot of places, they don't inspect their forklifts. It's required, it's mandatory, it's a CYA. It should be a very large part of your maintenance, preventative maintenance program, and it needs to be done at the start of each shift. So if you have 3 people on a shift that are using the same forklift during the day, do they each need to do a pre-shift inspection and fill out a formal piece of paper? No. One person should do it. Should the second and third person check the forklift before they use it? Yes. Do they need to fill out a piece of paper? Not necessarily. Checking your forklift to make sure that it's in a safe condition for you to use is very important for many reasons. One, you want to make sure that it's safe to use. 2, it's a CYA. You're covering your assets. You are making sure that the forklift is okay for you to use, but if it's not okay for you to use, then you're going to report it. And you're not going to be blamed for the damage that it has been done to it or something that is wrong with it. If it's not safe to use, it needs to be taken out of commission until it is safe to use. So having a maintenance person be in charge of that, whatever, there should be someone that is in charge of your paper pre-shift inspections. That goes back to your maintenance department or the person that comes in to work on your forklifts. Never allow someone that does not know how to work on a forklift work on a forklift.
Georgette, 2 questions came in.
Okay.
This is the trigger slide for a lot of people.
Okay.
One from John. He's asking, do these inspections need to be recorded? And then I'm going to follow up with another question from Jane. How long do these forms need to be recorded? Well, I think she meant record keeping.
So record keeping. Okay, so the first part of the question is, yes, it needs to be some kind of a written piece of paper that is saved in a file somewhere, and I would say for at least a year. So if there's any, say for example, somebody gets hurt on the forklift, and they can come back to the company and say, well, I've been complaining about that for months and they never got it fixed. Is there a record of it? Mm. Right? Okay. And that's the main, that is one of the reasons right there. It's again covering your assets, right?
Good point.
Yeah. So it's very easy. It doesn't take long. I've had so many people say to me, well, I don't have time to do a pre-shift inspection. Well, when I train a pre-shift inspection, it takes about 15 minutes. When you do a pre-shift inspection, it should not take you more than 3 or 4 minutes. And if that person is the person that is supposed to check the oil and check the transmission fluid and all that, yes, it's going to take a little bit longer. But I would not recommend that a regular operator do that part of it, that you have a regular maintenance program, either a maintenance guy on site, or if you have a company that comes in to do the maintenance on your forklift, that's when that stuff is done. So hopefully that answers the question. Yeah. Okay. All right, so refueling and recharging. Again, this is important. Depending on whether you have an electric forklift or a gas forklift, your refueling is important to make sure that it's trained and that they understand the hazards of refueling. And I can't emphasize that enough. If you are refilling a propane tank, which when I first started driving a forklift, we had to do our own. And it was cold outside sometimes. There was snow on the ground. Who wanted to go outside and fill up your propane tank? So you do shortcuts? Hopefully not. So if depending on how you have to refuel your forklift, make sure that they understand what the hazards are from that, from propane and from electric. Wearing the appropriate PPE is very, very important. Making sure that the propane bottles are shut down before you start to load the tank up with propane is very important. And the other thing that needs to be, people need to be trained on is propane is heavier than air. Propane is, this is how I say it, propane is like a snake. It will, if you're in a room, the propane that is out in the air will sink to the ground and it will seek its lowest point. It'll be like a little snake sitting in a corner. And if it can't go anywhere else, there's not enough air in the room to dissipate it, and somehow there's a spark or something, then it could cause problems. So propane, they need to understand what the hazards are. So make sure that that's part of the training. And sometimes if what you can do, the propane company that you get propane from or that brings your tanks in, they can come in and do that training for you. Always cleaning up your spills immediately from any type of work that you're doing on a forklift, your oil spills or anything like that is very important, so that slips, trips, and falls or breathing it, any of those kind of things are unsafe for that. Recharging, make sure the truck is turned off. Recharging electric batteries only in designated and well ventilated areas, which is very important. It could conduct sparking if it's not done correctly. So again, wearing proper PPE, training the person in the proper way to recharge a forklift. Again, the manufacturer, because if you're buying an electric forklift, usually you get the charger that comes along with it, and having the manufacturer come in and do that part of the training for you could be one of the ways that you get that done. All right, that's it. Pretty sweet, right? Short and sweet, I hope. Just remember that there's a lot of different sections of training that your employee needs to go through. So just don't bring a person on site and they tell you they can drive a forklift and put them on a forklift and let them go. The mandatory rules are that they have to be trained. You have to know that they understand what the type of equipment and the hazards that they are going to encounter when they're in the workplace.